The storm howled across the Scottish Highlands like a beast let loose from the depths of the earth. Snow whirled in violent sheets, clawing at the mountainsides, burying roads, and swallowing the night whole. Headlights cut through the darkness in fragile beams as a sleek black car crawled up a narrow, ice-crusted road, its tires fighting to keep grip. Inside, Miles Davenport leaned forward at the wheel, his jaw locked tight, his knuckles pale against the leather. For years, people had called him untouchable, a millionaire with walls higher than his estate's gates, a man who lived with precision and distance. But tonight, the storm pressed against him in ways he couldn't name, forcing him to look outward, as though something waited for him beyond the glass. The dinner in Edinburgh should have ended in triumph, a business deal sealed, another victory in a long career built on dominance and control. Yet Miles had left restless, his thoughts as unsettled as the snow swirling over the Highland roads. The storm mirrored something inside him, something he'd buried beneath polished suits and marble halls. He clenched his jaw and pressed on, telling himself the estate was only minutes away. Warmth and solitude waiting for him beyond the gates. Then, in the sweep of his headlights, he saw them dot at first. He thought the storm was playing tricks on his eyes. Two small shapes pressed against the iron gates, hunched and fragile, half buried in snow drifts. He blinked hard, his pulse quickening. The car slid as he braked, tires shrieking against ice. Before shuddering to a halt a few yards from the gates, the lights froze the figures in place. Not shadows, not tricks. Children. He cursed under his breath. Shoving the door open, the storm swallowed him whole. Wind ripped at his coat, snow stung his face like shards of glass. The cold cutting so deep it burned. Still, he pushed forward, polished shoes crunching through the ice, his breath tearing in ragged bursts. The figures sharpened as he drew closer to. Girls, no more than 7 or 8, huddled together under a coat too thin to protect them. Their hair was caked with ice, their lips pale, their small hands trembling. One of them clutched a battered sketchbook to her chest as though it were the last piece of life she had left. The other pounded weakly on the gate with her fists. As though sheer force might open it and save them, Miles stopped a step away, his chest tight. He had seen desperation before in cities where poverty pressed against every corner. But this was different. These were children, standing on his doorstep in a storm that could kill a grown man. "What are you doing out here?" The words came harsher than he meant, shaped by shock more than intent. The girls didn't answer, their wide eyes locked on him, frightened but unflinching. They clung tighter to each other as if bracing for whatever he might do. For one strange moment, Miles felt them measuring him, testing him not for wealth, not for power, but for the simplest thing, whether he could be trusted. He hesitated, the storm battering him, the cold clawing through his coat. Every instinct told him to keep his distance, to call someone else, to hand them off and retreat back into the walls he had built around himself. But the sight of them trembling against the iron bars silenced all logic. Without another thought, he stripped off his coat and wrapped it around both of them in one swift motion. They were weightless when he lifted them, one on each arm, their frozen bodies pressed against him. He turned toward the gates, pushing them open with his shoulder. Beyond, the long drive stretched toward the mansion, its windows glowing faintly. Through the storm like beacons in a sea of dark, the girls did not resist. They clung to him, their heads tucked against his chest, as though the sound of his heartbeat was the only warmth they trusted. By the time he reached the heavy oak doors, his muscles burned, his skin raw from the storm's bite. But when the doors opened, spilling firelight across the foyer, Miles realized something had already shifted. For the first time in years, the silence of the Davenport estate was broken not by business, not by servants, but by the fragile lives. Who had turned his isolation into a sanctuary? He carried them inside, and as the storm raged on outside, Miles Davenport understood that nothing about this night or his life would ever be the same again. The storm did not ease by morning. Snow lay heavy on the stone walls of the Davenport estate, piling high against the iron gates that had, only hours ago, been the barrier between life and death. Inside, however, the house stirred with an energy Miles had not felt in years. He had spent most of the night in the drawing room chair, his eyes fixed on the leather sofa where the twins lay bundled in blankets, their breathing shallow but steady. Every time he thought about calling the authorities, his gaze drifted back to the fragile outlines of their small forms pressed close together. Logic told him to let them go, Something deeper, something stubborn and half-buried told him he couldn't. When the first hint of light broke through the frost-covered windows, Miles finally stood. His body ached from sitting rigid all night, his thoughts fractured from lack of sleep. He moved toward the kitchen, following the smell of warm bread. Mrs. Whitaker was already at work, pulling loaves from the oven with her usual brisk efficiency. But even she looked unsettled. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway as though expecting the silence to shatter at any moment. And it did. The sound of small footsteps echoed against the marble floors, tentative, exploring. Miles turned. The girls had risen. They still wore the oversized blankets wrapped like cloaks, dragging against the polished floor. One of them he recognized her from the night before, as the one who had clutched the sketchbook moved with deliberate quiet, her pencil scratching across the worn paper as she drew the outlines of the vast dining table. Her sister, chin lifted, stepped into the kitchen as though testing how far she could go before someone stopped her. Mrs. Whitaker glanced at Miles. He nodded once. No words needed. Let them. For a long moment, he simply watched. His house once, so controlled, so silent, was alive with the smallest gestures. The scrape of a chair as the defiant girl climbed onto it. The scratch of pencil against paper. The faint smell of flour clinging to their hands. And in those details, Miles saw something that startled him. They weren't just surviving. They were claiming space. "You never told me your names," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. The girl with the sketchbook looked up. "Hannah," she whispered. The other lifted her chin, as if daring him to forget it. "Echo." Miles repeated the names silently, anchoring them in his mind. Hannah, Echo. The sound filled the air like something fragile, but permanent. He leaned against the table. "Your stepfather, why would he bring you here? Why my gates?" The silence stretched. Hannah glanced at Echo. For the first time, the defiant one faltered, her lips pressing into a thin line. She reached for her sister's hand. Hannah's small fingers opened the sketchbook, pushing it toward him. Miles froze. The page showed a coastline he knew intimately, cliffs rising over a wide bay, waves drawn and delicate. "Practice strokes. Monterey Bay," he whispered, his voice breaking on the name. He had grown up there, long before his parents' sudden deaths and the lonely years that had followed. Hannah nodded. "Our mother drew it. She said someone important to her once lived there." Miles felt something sharp pierce his chest. Their mother, a woman lying unconscious in a hospital bed, struck down by a car, clinging to life. Could she have known his family? Could their paths have crossed in a time when life was still whole? The question spiraled, but the connection was undeniable. "Where is she now?" he asked. "In the hospital," Echo said softly, her voice stripped of defiance for the first time. "She hasn't woken up." Miles sat heavily at the table. Their father gone, their mother silent, a stepfather who had left them at his gates like unwanted baggage. The picture formed in his mind was brutal. He thought of his own childhood after his parents' death, boarded away in cold schools, where there was food, yes, but no warmth. Security without kindness, survival without love. Mrs. Whitaker placed a teacup in front of him, her eyes steady on his. "You can't send them away," she said quietly, as the girls slipped from the room to wash their hands. "Not after what they've been through." Miles rubbed his temple. "And what would you have me do? Keep them here, like family?" The word caught in his throat. Foreign, awkward. Mrs. Whitaker didn't flinch. "Perhaps that's exactly what you should do." When the girls returned, damp hair framing their small faces, still wrapped in blankets too large for their shoulders, Miles looked at them differently. They sat close together, not asking, not pleading, just waiting. Hannah's sketchbook rested against her chest again, her lifeline. Echo's eyes stayed on him, challenging, defiant, but beneath it he saw the shimmer of fear. He could call the authorities. He could hand them off. That would be the safe choice, the rational choice, the choice that preserved the distance he had lived by. But as he looked at them, he knew the truth. Letting them go would not just be abandoning them, it would be abandoning himself. At last, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "You'll stay here until we know more about your mother. This is your home now." The words hung in the air like a vow. Hannah clutched the sketchbook tighter, her eyes shining with something unspoken. Echo blinked hard, her lips parting, as though to argue, but then she only nodded once, sharp and decisive. Outside, the storm still raged. But inside, within the walls of the Davenport estate, something new had taken hold, fragile, unsteady, but real, for the first time in years. Miles Davenport's house was no longer just a fortress of stone. It was the beginning of belonging. The storm outside had broken days ago, but inside the Davenport estate the air still carried its weight. A hush of unease woven beneath the fragile warmth that had begun to bloom. The halls, once silent, now echoed with small footsteps, the shuffle of blankets to long for the girls' frames, the scratch of a pencil against paper. Yet behind every sound was a question, unanswered, unsettled. Miles knew it, felt it in the sharp edges of his thoughts. The world beyond these walls would not stay quiet for long. One afternoon, he stood in the library, pretending to read while Hannah curled in an armchair near the window. Sketchbook balanced on her knees. The firelight painted her face in soft tones, but her hand moved with a precision that startled him. She wasn't just copying the shelves in front of her. She was adding things that weren't there. A vase of flowers, shafts of sunlight breaking through the glass, color where there had only been dust. "You've changed it," Miles said softly, stepping closer. Hannah didn't look up. "It's how it should be." Those words struck something deep, and he carried them long after leaving the room. For years, he had accepted the estate as it was beautiful, vast, but hollow, every room echoing with emptiness he pretended not to feel. And here was a child who looked at the same rooms and insisted they could be different, better. But even as the mansion stirred with life, shadows pressed closer. It began with a phone call. The voice on the other end belonged to a man Miles knew only distantly, a dinner acquaintance from the city. The words were laced with curiosity, tainted with malice. "I hear you've taken in children. The little girl seen at your gates during the storm. Is it true?" Miles's grip on the receiver tightened until his knuckles whitened. He said only, "It's no one's concern but mine," before slamming the phone back into its cradle. But he knew it wouldn't end there. Gossip in Edinburgh traveled faster than wildfire, and secrets had a way of becoming weapons. 2 days later, the letter arrived. It was formal, typed on thick paper that smelled faintly of London ink. The language was precise, dressed in legal dignity, but the meaning was sharp as a blade. The twin stepfather was filing for custody. He claimed concern, claimed paternal rights, painted himself as a man eager to reunite with his family. But Miles could read the spaces between the lines. This was not love. This was control, and perhaps something darker. He folded the letter with slow care, slipping it into the desk drawer, locking it away. For now, the girls would not know. They had lived along under shadows. Let them breathe in the light a little longer. But Aiko was not a child who let silence stand. That night, she appeared in the doorway of the library, her small frame stiff, her eyes hard. "You're going to send us back, aren't you?" she demanded. Her voice trembled beneath the defiance. But she forced it steady. Miles set aside, his glass and rose, his gaze meeting hers. For a long moment, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch until her fists clenched at her sides. Then his voice cut through, steady as iron. "No, not if I have anything to say about it." Aiko blinked fast, her jaw tightening as though she wanted to argue, to test him. But instead she nodded once, sharp, the flicker of trust in her eyes both fragile and fierce. She turned on her heel, disappearing down the hall. Later, when he entered the drawing room, he found Hannah asleep by the fire, sketchbook open on her lap. On the page was a drawing of the gates of the estate, not closed and frozen as they had been that first night, but wide open, sunlight spilling over the drive. Beneath the iron arches stood 3 figures, 2 girls and a man, side by side. Miles stared at the drawing until his vision blurred. For the first time, he saw himself not as the lonely figure on the hill, but as part of something he had thought forever beyond his reach. A family dot, and yet the letter in his desk burned like a coal. The stepfather would not disappear. His claim would come like another storm, not of snow and ice this time, but of courts, lies, and greed. Miles felt the weight of it pressing closer. The shadow of a man who had abandoned these girls, daring to call himself their guardian. He poured himself a drink, staring out the tall windows into the night. Snow still blanketed the grounds, but the silence was deceptive. The real storm had not yet come, and in the quiet, Miles Davenport admitted something to himself he had never dared before. He could not imagine this house without them. The winter skies over Edinburgh had softened into gray, but inside Miles Davenport's estate, the tension had not lifted, Every day the girls moved deeper into his home, their presence reshaping spaces he had long abandoned to silence. Echo followed Mrs. Whitaker through the kitchen like a shadow, always questioning, always testing. Hannah drifted from room to room with her sketchbook, capturing details with such care that Miles sometimes wondered if she saw truths invisible to anyone else. Yet even as warmth bloomed in corners where there had only been cold, the locked drawer in his study held a secret that gnawed at him. The letter, the threat of the stepfather, the storm that had yet to break. One evening, while the girls sketched at the table and Mrs. Whitaker baked bread, Miles stepped into his office and poured himself a drink. He unlocked the drawer and unfolded the letter once more. The stepfather's words, tapped with calculated formality, mocked him. Custody, rights, welfare. On the surface, concern. Beneath it, greed and ownership. Miles had built an empire by dismantling lies dressed in velvet, and he recognized this. One for what it was, a claim on children he had abandoned, now disguised as responsibility. Miles clenched the paper in his hand until it crumpled. He could not let it stand. But there was another shadow he had avoided along, the girl's mother. Every time he looked at them, Hannah's eyes searching his face. Echo stubborn, chin raised in defiance, he thought of her lying in a hospital bed, breathing but silent, holding secrets only she could answer. For days he had put it off, unwilling to face what he might find. But that night, staring into the fire, he made his choice. He would go. The following morning, he told Mrs. Whitaker he had business in the city. He did not tell the girls where he was going. They watched him with unreadable expressions as he left, Hannah clutching her sketchbook to her chest, Echo narrowing her eyes as though she could see through him. He carried their gaze with him all the way to the hospital. The sterile corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and sorrow. Nurses passed him with clipped steps, but his tailored coat and the weight of his presence cleared the way without question. A young doctor led him to the room. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering above the handle, as though something inside might unravel him more completely than any courtroom battle. Then he pushed it open. The woman lay pale against white sheets, her hair spread across the pillow like a shadow. Machines hummed quietly, measuring her heart, her breath. Miles froze, his chest tight. He had expected a stranger, someone whose name would mean nothing, but as he stepped closer, memories stirred like ghosts, places, faces, moments from a life he had buried under stone. Monterey Bay, sunlight on cliffs, a voice he could almost remember laughing in the wind. He studied her features. Time and hardship had left their marks, but there was something undeniable. Had she once stood with him on those cliffs? Had she once spoken words that still echoed faintly in his chest? His throat tightened. He wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the silence of her coma gave none. He pulled a chair closer and sat. For the first time in years, Miles Davenport did not think of contracts or acquisitions or victories. He thought only of two girls left at his gates in a storm, and of the woman who had carried their lives this far. He leaned forward, his voice low, uncertain. Who are you to me, and why? Why send them to me? No answer came, only the steady rhythm of the monitor. Yet as he sat there, he realized something startling. He wanted her to wake not only for the girls, but for himself, for the questions clawing at his own silence. When he returned to the estate that evening, the girls were waiting in the drawing room. Hannah's eyes went first to his face, searching, as though she could read the weight of his silence. Echo stood stiffly, arms crossed, a demand waiting on her tongue. Miles did not speak. Instead, he crossed to the fireplace and poured himself a drink. The silence stretched taut until Hannah opened her sketchbook and slid it across the table toward him. On the page, she had drawn the three of them herself, Echo, and Miles standing not inside the mansion, but in a hospital room, beside a bed. The figure of a woman lay there, and above her the caption written in careful letters, "Wake up. We are here." Miles's chest ached. He looked up at Hannah, her quiet eyes steady on his. He looked at Echo, her jaw tight, her arms still crossed, but her gaze softening just enough to betray the fear beneath her defiance. The truth pressed hard against him. He could no longer pretend this was temporary, no longer pretend he was only a guardian by chance. These children had tied their lives to his, and whether he was ready or not, he was bound to them. That night, as the snow fell gently outside, not a storm now, but a soft, drifting curtain, Miles stood at his study, window and admitted what he had tried to bury. He had spent a lifetime building walls of stone and steel, keeping the world at bay. But 2 children abandoned in a blizzard and a woman lying silent in a hospital bed had torn those walls open, and he knew, with a certainty that cut deeper than any business deal or court battle, that the fight ahead would not just be for them. It would be for himself. The day of the hearing broke with skies the color of steel. Snow still clung to the edges of Edinburgh streets, though the great storm had long since passed. The city bustled as usual, but for Miles Davenport, each sound of carriage wheels, each clang of distant bells, felt muted beneath the weight pressing on his chest. Today, the children's fate would not be decided in warmth or firelight, but beneath the cold gaze of the law. He had risen before dawn, pacing the estate in silence, listening to the girls stir in their rooms. Echo tried to act fearless, but her voice the night before had trembled when she asked if he would be there when the judge spoke. Hannah said little, but she drew until sleep finally stole her drawings of the 3 of them standing together in a courtroom, her fragile hope, inked into paper. Miles had taken the sketch with him, folded carefully into his pocket, as though carrying her faith could anchor his own. The courtroom was austere, its high ceilings and stern wooden benches casting a chill over everyone who entered. At one table sat the stepfather, a man with neatly combed hair and polished shoes, his expression arranged into something that almost resembled concern. Beside him, a London art dealer leaned close, whispering words to low for others to catch, his eyes flicking toward Hannah as if she were not a child, but a commodity die at the opposite table. Eleanor Reeves stood tall and unflinching. The lawyer Miles had chosen was known for her precision, for stripping the masks from men who had cruelty behind charm. She leaned toward Miles now, her voice low but certain. "We dismantle him piece by piece. Stay steady." The judge entered, robes whispering across the floor, her expression carved from stone. Silence fell as the case began. The stepfather's counsel spoke first, painting him as a man misunderstood, a victim of circumstance, desperate to reunite with the children fate had cruelly separated from him. He spoke of welfare, of family unity, of parental rights. Each word rang hollow, but they filled the air with a dangerous rhythm, the kind of lies that had swayed courts before. Then Eleanor rose. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the chamber like a blade. She spoke of abandonment, of 2 girls left in a snowstorm at midnight, their bodies weakened from cold and malnutrition. She called Mrs. Whitaker to the stand, her testimony steady as she described the night Miles had carried the children through the storm, the way they clung to each other even in their sleep. A physician followed, detailing the signs of neglect written on their bodies, piece by piece. Eleanor dismantled the illusion, stripping away every thread until the man who sat across from them was revealed for what he was. Not a guardian, not a protector, but a man who had treated children like burdens he could discard. Still, the stepfather smirked, leaning back in his chair, as though confident money and words would be enough. Then the judge asked for the children, the courtroom still. Echo walked in first, her chin lifted, though her hands trembled at her sides. Hannah followed close, clutching her sketchbook like armor. They climbed the steps together, small figures beneath the towering presence of law. Echo spoke first. Her voice wavered, but she forced it clear. "He left us. He said someone else would take care of us. He didn't want to." Her words fell like stones, each syllable shattering the false concern their stepfather had woven. Then Hannah stepped forward. She opened her sketchbook, hands shaking, and held it up for the judge to see. The drawing showed 3 figures by the fire, storm raging outside, but warmth alive within. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried across the silence. "This is our home." Because he stayed, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the judge's stern expression softened for the briefest flicker. Miles felt his throat tighten, a pressure in his chest he could not disguise. When the judge finally looked to him, he rose slowly. He did not reach for eloquence. He did not speak as the millionaire known for crushing boardrooms. He spoke simply, truthfully. He told of the night he found them, to fragile lives abandoned at his gates. He spoke of the laughter slowly seeping back into his mansion, of Hannah's drawings that turned emptiness into light, of Echo's questions that tested every wall he had built around himself. He told the court what no one else could, that in saving them, he had been saved himself. When he finished, silence settled again, heavier than snow. The judge studied them all for a long, unbroken moment, then delivered her ruling. Custody awarded to Miles Davenport. Permanent guardianship to follow upon the mother's recovery or decline. The stepfather's face drained of color, his polished mask collapsing under the weight of his failure. The art dealer turned away, lips pressed then. With frustration, none of their words, none of their plans had been enough. Relief surged through Miles like a tide. Aiko gripped his hand so tightly it hurt, but he did not let go. Hannah leaned against his side. Sketchbook clutched to her chest, as if she had drawn this very moment into being. Outside, snow began to fall again out the brutal storm that had brought them to his gates, but a quiet blessing drifting from the sky. And as Miles led them out of the courtroom, he realized with startling clarity that this victory was not an end. It was a beginning. The ruling should have been the end of it. The courtroom had fallen silent under Hannah's whisper, under Aiko's trembling defiance, under Miles's confession that for the first time in his life, wealth had not been enough, only belonging had. The stepfather had slunk away, his false concern shattered in front of the judge. The art dealer, with his greedy eyes on Hannah's talent, had turned cold and left without a word. By all accounts, the danger was over. Custody was his. The children were safe. And yet, when the doors of the courthouse closed and Miles led the twins back to the waiting car, he could not shake the weight pressing at his chest. Relief had flooded him, yes, but so had something else, responsibility that no ruling could lighten. He was no longer just the man who had carried them in from the storm. He was the man who had promised them a home, and promises, he knew, had the power to break or save a life. Back at the estate, the transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. The great stone mansion, once an echoing fortress of silence, filled with sounds he had never known and craved. Laughter bounced down the halls. Doors once locked for decades swung open. As Hannah explored their forgotten corners, sketchbook always in hand, Aiko demanded to know everything: the names of the paintings, the stories behind the old clocks, even why the sun shifted differently across the east wing windows in the mornings. Mrs. Whitaker, once the sole keeper of the estate's rhythms, found herself with two eager assistants. Aiko learned to knead dough with hands too small for the task, but stubborn enough to master it. Hannah quietly arranged flowers she picked from the winter garden, drying them before they wilted. Even Miles himself was pulled into their orbit, sitting at the long dining table not as a solitary figure anymore, but as part of something larger, something warmer. Still, shadows lingered. Each week, Miles drove the girls into the city to visit their mother. Each week, they carried flowers and drawings, speaking softly to her as though she could hear, telling her about the estate, about bread baking, about sketches and fireplaces, and snowmen built in the courtyard. Miles stayed at the doorway, silent, his chest heavy. The woman's face never changed. She lay still, as if trapped in a dream she could not escape. One evening, after such a visit, Hannah handed Miles her sketchbook once more. This time, the page showed the hospital room, but unlike reality, sunlight poured through the windows. Their mother was sitting upright, smiling, her hand clasping theirs. At the bottom, in Hannah's careful handwriting, was one word. Soon, the image unsettled him. Was it hope? Or was it prophecy? Hannah had a way of drawing not just what was, but what should be. And yet, what if soon never came? He lay awake that night, staring at the dark canopy of his bed, wondering if he was enough to hold them together if their mother never woke. The outside world, too, was not entirely silent. Whispers of gossip still reached his ears at dinners he no longer cared to attend. The story of the untouchable Davenport who had taken in children spun through Edinburgh society with a mixture of fascination and disdain. Some praised his generosity, others called it madness, but Miles found himself unmoved. Let them whisper. For the first time in his life, the opinions of strangers felt as cold and irrelevant as the snow melting on his gates. One night, while the twins slept, Miles wandered into the library where Hannah had left her latest sketches spread across the table. He picked one up, his throat tightening. She had drawn the estate's great gates again, but this time, instead of a storm, spring. Blossoms climbed over the iron, birds perched on the arches, and three figures walked through together into the light. Beneath it, she had written one word, home. The letters blurred as he stared. Home. He had built this place with marble and stone, with contracts and iron gates. But it had never been a home until two children had forced their way into his world. With nothing but fear, defiance, and a sketchbook, He closed the book carefully and stood by the fire, feeling the weight of his promise anchor him deeper than any empire he had ever built. He had been many things in his life: a millionaire, a businessman, a man untouchable by the world. But standing in that room, hearing the faint laughter of children in their dreams drifting down the hall, he knew he was something else now. A guardian, a father in all but name, and yet the shadow of the hospital remained. A question mark that refused to vanish. Each visit pressed harder against him. Each week the girls looked to their mother with hopeful eyes, speaking as though she could rise and answer them. Each week she did not. Miles feared what would happen when hope began to crack. But Hannah's words soon haunted him. Could she know something he did not? Was her art only imagination, or was it the truth waiting to be revealed? The winter air settled quiet around the estate that night. Snow glittered under the moonlight, soft and silent. The storm that had once nearly killed them was gone. But Miles knew another storm still brewed, this one inside him. The storm of waiting, of hoping, of fearing what the next dawn might bring. He stood at the tall windows, the fire's glow behind him, and whispered to the empty night a vow he had never spoken before. Whatever comes, I won't let them face it alone. The hospital room had always been a place of stillness. Machines hummed in patient rhythm. Curtains swayed faintly with each draft from the vents, and the twin soft voices filled the silence like prayers whispered into the void. For weeks, Miles had stood in the doorway, watching Hannah and Eiko speak to their mother, offering her drawings and flowers, begging her in their own quiet ways to return to them. And for weeks, nothing had changed. She had lain motionless, pale, caught in a world none of them could reach. But on that night, something felt different before Miles even stepped into the ward. The air carried a weight that prickled at his skin. A tension coiled tight, as though the world itself was holding its breath. He found the twins already at her bedside, Hannah pressing a new sketch into her mother's hand, Eiko stubbornly recounting every detail of the day at the estate, how she had baked bread, almost as well as Mrs. Whitaker, how Hannah had drawn. The gates in bloom again. Miles opened his mouth to speak, to tell them it was late and they should rest, but the words died on his lips, because their mother's fingers twitched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Hannah saw it. Her eyes widened, and she gasped, clutching her sister's arm. She moved, she whispered. Eiko leaned forward, her defiance crumbling into raw hope. Mom, can you hear us? Miles's heart thundered in his chest. He stepped closer, every instinct demanding caution, reminding him that bodies sometimes stirred in coma without meaning. And yet, as he reached the bedside, he saw at the flutter of her eyelids, faint but undeniable. The steady rhythm of the monitor ticked faster. Her lips parted, a ghost of sound escaping. The twins clung to her hands, calling for her, tears already spilling down their cheeks. Miles stood frozen, his entire world narrowing to the fragile figure before him. He had told himself not to hope, not to imagine what could be. But Hannah's drawings had haunted him soon. She had written, and now, impossibly, it was happening. Her eyes open, unfocused at first, searching the ceiling, then drifting toward the sound of her daughter's voices. Her lips moved again, weak, cracked. This time, a word formed, a name. Miles. The sound shattered him. He staggered back a step, every wall he had built across decades collapsing in an instant. She knew him, not just as the man who had taken her daughters in, not just as the wealthy figure whispered about in courts and papers. She had known him before. Mom. Eiko choked out, clutching her hand tighter. It's us. Hannah and me were here. We're safe. Her eyes shifted slowly, finding the girls, lingering on them with tears gathering at the corners. Then, painfully, she turned her gaze to him. The look pierced through every layer of armor he had ever worn. Recognition, memory, a connection he had buried deep enough to believe it lost. Miles's chest ached with questions. When? How? Why had she never come back into his life until fate forced her children to his gates? He wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the twins clung to her too tightly, their joy too fragile to break with the weight of his past. Hannah pressed her sketchbook into her mother's lap, opening to the page she had drawn days ago. The hospital room filled with sunlight, their mother upright, smiling. See, she whispered. I knew. Tears slipped down the woman's face. She squeezed their hands, weak but certain, and then, her gaze still locked on Miles, she whispered again, I told them you would help. I told them if they found you, you would never turn away. The truth fell on him like thunder. She had sent them, Even from the edges of her own darkness, she had remembered him, trusted him, chosen him. The storm that had brought them together had not been an accident of fate. It had been her last act of faith. The twins wept into her hands, there, small bodies trembling with relief. Miles stood rooted in place, every fragment of his past colliding with the present, every scar he had carried unraveling under the weight of what she had said. For years he had lived in isolation, convinced that distance was strength, that walls were protection. But here, in a hospital room lit only by the glow of machines and the fragile light in her eyes, he understood that he had been wrong all along. Belonging had not been something lost to him. It had only been waiting outside. Snow began to fall. Again, soft and slow, blanketing the city not in storm, but in quiet blessing. The storm that had once threatened to consume them had carried them here, to this moment. And as Miles finally reached out, his hand closing over theirs, he realized the truth Hannah had been sketching all along. They were no longer fragments. They were a family, and nothing, not gossip, not courts, not storms could take that from them again.